Hello. With this short video, I would like to demonstrate how to use some of the data that is available regarding the coronavirus and make an assessment of how different countries have been affected by the pandemic and what we might expect in the future. But most of all, just to try and compare things apple to apples, even though country at different sizes and location, they have been affected at different times, and so we would like to understand what are the corrections we need to make to look at the data in a meaningful way. One aspect that I'll look at is the issue of flattening the curve. This has been early on one of the main concerns because a curve like the red one here that will go up very quickly can create a situation where the healthcare system is overwhelmed and people cannot get the help they need. And while a flattened curve, even though it might involve the same number of people affected, it would have a lower maximum, a lower peak, and therefore allow the healthcare system to be fully responsive in terms of what are the needs of the population. In this analysis, I've been looking at data in particular taken from the Worldometer website. Although there are many other websites, I think the sources are more or less the same. But in principle, one would have to check how reliable is the data and so on. This is the latest information as of end of May. And I'm going to go in more detail of how two countries, Italy and the US, have been affected over time. The choice was not random. I'm Italian, so I've been following the events in Italy and how my family was affected and so on. And been living in the US for quite a long time, and so obviously I'm in tune with the local events and how things are evolving as well. So the Worldometer website already provide easily a table like this. It's a nice interactive table. You can sort the data by deaths per million population, so it can already start to normalize the data with respect to the size of the country. And so what under this metric, we can see that Italy has been affected quite a bit. The number of deaths is over 33,000 over a population of 60 million, so the death rate is 553. While the US, although has the largest number of deaths, has also a very large population. In fact, it's like 5.5 times than Italy. So the death rate is actually 320, so quite a bit lower. Just to give a sense, for example, new deaths today are 75 in Italy, and so and 369 in the US. Now, if we multiply 75 by 5, we get actually a number that is roughly the same as the US, maybe a little higher. But again, those numbers then are kind of equivalent. And so that's something that we need to be taking care of during the analysis. So in terms of total numbers, so those rates give us a ratio of 553 over 320. So the ratio between the two is 173%. So Italy had overall almost, not quite, twice as many deaths as the US. It's kind of 73% more. It's kind of 1 3/4. So quite a bit more. But it's interesting to look at, well, how this has evolved over time and what are the explanations. And so the time analysis is what I'm going to go after. And so in trying to produce a plots that are similar to the one here we see on the bottom left. So this is the raw data of deaths per million day by day. So in the horizontal axis, those are the days since roughly the beginning of the pandemic, according to a lot of the statistics collected out there. And first thing we notice that the curves are not as smooth as expected, as if the deaths would have those cycles up and down, which seems a little bit surprising. Now, after a little bit of further analysis, we notice that actually those cycles align perfectly with the weekdays. So you have dips in reporting during weekends. So it seems more likely not that the virus kill fewer people on weekends, but probably our data collection and reporting is affected by our weekly routines. And so for this reason, it makes sense to think of smoothing the data a little bit and look at a trend that remove a little bit of those artifacts. And so this is kind of the data that I will be using for the analysis moving forward. If I look at the data from Italy, we have the same issue. We see these cycles. In fact, even those cycles are also on a weekly basis, so it kind of confirm the hypothesis, although again it's not necessarily 100% confirmed. And so here I'll smooth it down again so that now we have two data sets that are a little bit easier to compare side by side. So this is the same time axis and this is the same axis of deaths per million. A first observation is that the peak in Italy has been at almost 14 deaths per million, while the US was a little bit lower than 7. So the peak in Italy has been roughly twice as high as the US. So in terms of flattening the curve, clearly Italy was affected more and was less successful in doing so. Now, this is easily explained by the fact that Italy has been struck much earlier, so the system was now, I guess, ready, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of the understanding of what was going to happen and reacting quickly to the situation. So this delay also can be measured. And instead of trying to pick up the first movement higher up from 0, which is a little bit harder to spot, we can look at when the peak happens. And so we see a delay of roughly 2.5 weeks from Italy to the US, and this is kind of something that gave the US, but also many other countries, kind of lead time to adjust and to what was coming. So to make the two visualization and the histograms better comparable, we can shift the data by 2.5 weeks, and then we get histograms that are now better aligned. And so we have as expected, so something that is flattening the curve. Now the slope in Italy is much rapidly going down. And now it's as if the time series in the US has been truncated earlier. So we don't count anymore the calendar days, but we count weeks since the beginning of the pandemic in each local area within a nation. And so here we would expect the blue line having been flattened to also cross over and becoming higher than the red one in the future, although that's a future we already see for Italy, but not yet for the US. So if we go back to the questions of flattening the curve and compare to the visualization that was provided in the New York Times, now, although we don't know where the dashed line is in terms of healthcare system, it's very likely that Italy was less successful to address the problem and got overwhelmed more, and that's probably what has been shown in the news. In terms of the comparison of the total number also, we need to realize that, now the two are really living in two different timelines. And so the 33,000 deaths, which is the area under the red line, are kind of an unfair comparison with the blue part, because there is a portion that the US does not account for yet. So if we eliminate this part of the red area, the deaths actually go down to 31,106. So this is actually a better apple-to-apple comparison between the deaths into two countries. And so as we do that, we will have to revise our numbers and even the way we report them. So instead of saying, this is a particular date, May 30, here we will be at week 14 of the pandemic within a particular country. And so the number of deaths per million goes down to 514 in Italy, while it's 320 in the US. And so the percentage is actually 161 instead of 173. And that would be a better way to measure things in terms of comparing the two countries. So in this case, the adjustment was not huge, but again, it goes from, say, 1.5 instead of 1 3/4. But more importantly, I think it's a good example of how the data has to be handled, how we renormalize things, how we have to shift timelines, and maybe also smooth down with respect to artifacts in the data. And thank you very much for your attention.